Good morning and welcome to our next So What If panel, a gender-based approach to safety, creating a safer future for younger generations. So our panel today, the subject is perceptions. So we're going to look at how each of our perceptions do shape how safety is just now and how it's been shaped through history. And we're going to look at the conscious and the subconscious perceptions that we all have. We've got a good panel today. So we've got Maddie, Lee, Dawn and Lou. I'm pointing as if you can all have seen in the same places that I can. So it's great to have such a mix of people here. So to give people a quick, anyone that's watching that doesn't know So What, but what if is, this is a campaign that has been created after a women's safety campaign we did last November with Thriving Survivors and Glasgow Girls Club and myself from One for Growth. And it grew arms and legs and has become a safety campaign in general, which will run for the full year until the 9th of December 2022. And every month we cover a different subject that will impact safety. So we have covered youth. We've got a youth panel as well who do a goggle box and watch all our panels and give their view on it as well. We've got some really meaty subjects coming up over the next few months. We've got sex workers and pornography. We've got online gaming and consent. We've got grooming. We've got a men's panel. We've got other safety campaigns coming together. And then it all combines at the very end to a face-to-face event for everybody in December. So what, but what if? The name is really important. It was chosen by a group of survivors and they were fed up with everyone saying, so what? So what if you have to walk home speaking to your friends because you're scared, or so what? The list of so what's is massive. And they were like, well, what if we didn't have to do that? What if we created a platform where everybody could come together rather than everyone fighting their own campaigns, make a bigger platform? So that's what So What, but what if is. And what we're going to do is take everybody's what ifs at the end of the year and use that along with all the evidence and learnings we've had through the year to create a list of asks to go to the Scottish and the UK governments at the end of the year. So that's a wee introduction to So What, but what if is, because at the end we will ask all our panels members to give us their what ifs. So that's enough from me. We're going to go straight on to having our discussion around perceptions. So we're going to go around the table, so to speak, and ask everyone just to give us a quick introduction as to who you are and why this safety campaign is important to you. So I'm just going to go from my left to right. So Maddie, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so my name is Maddie. I am a non-binary writer and researcher, and I'll be starting my PhD in autumn. I care about this campaign because I'm really concerned about a lot of anti-trans legislation that's being passed through in the UK and a lot of anti-trans discourse. And also, I guess my qualifications are that I read a lot of gender theory and a lot of gender literature. And especially recently, I've been getting into biology and neuroscience to try and understand it from a kind of biological angle. So I have quite a lot of information in my brain. I hope I can convey it today in a succinct way.
Thank you, Maddie. Lou.
Hi, I'm Lou. I'm a non-binary artist from Glasgow, primarily music, but I do a bunch of other things, and it all kind of focuses around social activism and trans rights. And why I'm interested in being here today is just with a rise in LGBTQ hate crime, and particularly hate crimes against trans people on the rise in Scotland in the last few years. It's an issue that's quite personal to me, and I want to educate people around that and see if some changes can be made towards trans people's safety.
Perfect, thanks Lou. Lee?
Hi, how you doing? I am Lee McGuinness, owner of Elite Plumbing and Building Solutions. And the reason why I'm on this panel today is because I do feel as if my industry is very male dominated, and I think this perception in exercise has to change. And also since the birth of my daughter 2 years ago, Bella Rose, I would also like to see things change for her going forward, to not get pushed into industries that she feels she has to be in, but might not necessarily want to be in, because at this moment in time, her two favourite things to do is to play on a digger and play on a tractor, and which are pretty much related to my industry. And I just don't want her to ever think that if that interest keeps up going forward, that she can't do what she wants to do, if that's what she wants to do.
Perfect, thanks Lee. Dawn?
Hi, I'm Dawn Fife and I work at Wise Women in Glasgow. We're a unique organisation. We work with women on their personal safety. Started in 1994, so we've got a long history of it, although I wasn't there at that point, but we've been around for a long time. We're based within the violence against women sector in Glasgow, and we are involved in strategic work within the city as well. And recently we worked with Glasgow Girls Club to do a safety app, which was why we were on the last panel, which was great. So really looking forward to the discussion today and thinking about how women's safety all fits within the rest of the community, which is something that feminist organisations have always done. It's always been about women, children and others. So really looking forward to the discussion today. So thank you for inviting me along and nice to meet everybody.
Thanks Dawn, it's nice to have you back as well.
Can I just say as well, I've got somebody's decided to start installing a boiler above me. As you do, so I'll go into mute if I need to, just in case.
I think we're all used to 2 years of being on Zooms, that there's going to be disruptions, so please do not worry. We have kids and dogs and everything else running in. So Dawn, I'd like to start a discussion with you around perceptions. So when we started as a group at So What discussing perceptions, the first thing we were talking about was the male to female, female to male perceptions, and specifically how history has shaped that. So not that far back in history, women were to stay at home. They were to, cook the food, clean the house, look after the kids, and just be good wives. So I just want to start with that side of perceptions. How do you see that that's still around? What an impact that has had, and yeah, are we coming out of that? Is that still having an impact on how safety is for women at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think we can see that it's certainly changed. I think the challenge is that women have never really been only in the household, depending on their status, depending on their income, depending on their circumstances. Many working class women and women in other places in life, so women women who were taken into slavery, things like that, were always outside the home. That their opportunity to be with children, to be in the home, was always limited. I think we have when we look back in history, the information we get is very much about a middle class experience, and that of working class people potentially striving for that, but also being told that's how they should live, and that's why they could never actually achieve that, because the structures weren't in place to allow them to achieve what was expected of women at that time. As times went on, we've seen different industries, we've seen more pressures on women, we've seen the changing, even in the NHS, about when women could go back after having children, the impact of pregnancy. All these things impact on how women can actually function. And I think when we see introductions of things like welfare rights, then that's helped women to be able to function by themselves with their children, and allows them to escape violence where it exists. The difficulty we can see is how vulnerable that is. And you can see it through the institutions, can't you? Because traditionally women were seen as possessions of men, and that might be in individual relationships, but sometimes not. We know of lots of women through history whose fathers and husbands have encouraged them, but institutions like marriage, institutions like lack of protection, things like that, have meant that women where that wasn't their experience were particularly vulnerable. We're in a new phase where women have more opportunities, depending on the circumstances, and you can see that where there's conflict. So, for example, in the Ukraine just now, you see a lot of conversation about sexual assault, rape. So where there's conflict, where there's a reduction in protection, women immediately and children immediately become vulnerable, and we tend to slip back into those stereotypes of women being vulnerable to being owned by men. And so I think that although we've made huge leaps forward, I think that we also have a vulnerability to slipping back into old ways, depending on where crisis points are, but also for individual women where they have few options, where they have little support, where we still have a criminal justice system in this country that does not support women who experience, and children, I've got to say, who experience sexual assault and rape. Domestic abuse slightly better, but they've been overrun to the extent that it's taken too long to get through the courts. So the criminal justice system is not able to protect women. So while you've got that, if you're an individual woman who's experiencing it, then you have very little opportunity to escape that and very few places to go for protection. And as things like welfare rights changes, these are other opportunities, then that also thwarts any opportunity to leave. And we can see that with women coming through the immigration system who have no recourse to public funds, particularly vulnerable, and makes it extremely difficult for them to escape violence. So yes, we're making moves forward. This is fantastic, we're having these discussions, but we have to always remember that particularly working class women, particularly women with few resources and opportunity to leave, they are particularly vulnerable. So we have to keep that in mind and make sure that we have that protection and that support in place.
You know, it's interesting you're saying about when situations happen, such as conflict, or, you know, when people are vulnerable, is there support? Okay, if you take the legal side out of it just now, if we know that there's vulnerable women and children out there and they need help, do you think that one of the biggest issues could be the lack of help? Or I know there's a lot of organisations, is it hard to get that help? Is there enough support there? Or how do we move on if we know that is the group that needs help to be made safer? Where are we just now and what needs done there?
I think there's two things going on. One, there's not enough services. We have, Glasgow, we're really lucky, we've got a variety of violence against women's services, but they're nowhere near the capacity that they need to be able to support women. Not while we still have the cultural bit, which is the other bit, where we are still having to have conversations in 2022 about why it's not a woman's fault that she's raped and sexually assaulted. That's unacceptable. And I think as well, what we see a lot, and there's a lot of attempts to explain why particular women are particularly vulnerable, and very, very little discussion about, well, where is this violence and abuse coming from? So when we're a bit better now that we'll not say, but well, we'll still say it, we'll still get said in the courts, but we're kind of balk a wee bit when we hear people saying, but what was she wearing, or why was she walking down that lane? But the insinuation, the legal system round about that, none of that's changed. So you've still got a situation where women experience stigma around about the violence and abuse they experience, unlike other crimes. I know other groups that maybe experience sexual violence is the same, but like the other crimes, it's you don't get that same stigma. And also what that does is that then reinforces the socialisation that women have that they look inward and blame themselves. So from birth, they're taught, don't walk down lanes, don't talk back, don't do this, because parents naturally are trying to, they know they can't stop abusers, so they're trying to contain their daughters and their sons, but they're trying to contain them to try and prevent that from happening. Now, what that does, you can understand that, but what that can also do is reinforce in girls and women that they are responsible for any abuse that they might experience. So it's a challenge. So we've got structural issues about how we support and protect and give women ways to escape, because only by having these escape routes will abusers be more reluctant to abuse. Because if they think that there's going to be a reaction to that and that women can escape that abuse, if you're in a domestic violence situation, then if they think you've got that, then they're not going to do it. Or they're going to find somebody else to do it to. And that's so that structurally we have to get that right, but also culturally it's vitally important, because women are too often still women are going into court if they get to court and abusers get found not guilty. So it's really important that we do both.
Perfect, thank you, Dawn. Maddie, I know we've had multiple discussions outside of this about conscious and subconscious perceptions on various different subjects actually. I watched a Instagram video which I showed you and I found it really interesting, and it was talking again about male female, but the women, the one that was saying, you know, when we hear about things, we hear how many women have been raped, how many female teenagers got pregnant. We never hear how many men raped women or how many teenage boys or men got teenage girls pregnant. It's that passive voice that takes the focus away from men. It was like, well, violence against women. Well, no one did it, so there's violence against women. It's not male violence against women, it's always about the female. So I know that this is a subconscious thing, but it has come from history. Somewhere when these headlines were being made, it's been made with the woman as the focus, but it comes across as negative. So I want to talk about this and gender in general, about how do you feel people's perceptions about how things are written, how things are said, puts everybody in danger in different ways.
Great, yeah, so just to come across, or to go back to Dawn's point about the kind of history behind this, I actually studied in my undergraduate degree for history, I looked at sexual surveys from the 1950s in the UK. So these were surveys that were talking about people's sexual attitudes. And I mean, this is only a few decades ago. It's after World War II and everything. But people reported very commonly that they had, they didn't call it this, but they had a sexual double standard, which meant that they very strongly believed that women should be virgins before marriage and remain virgins, at least in their definition of virginity. It's a bit shaky, but they very strongly felt that. But they felt that men will be men. You can't control their sexuality. They're just going to do what they want to do, which is an extremely pessimistic view of men. But I think that has definitely stayed in our cultural consciousness. And it also puts women in a kind of trap where they're told that they need to set sexual boundaries, they need to establish sexual morality, sexual mores, but they're not educated about sexuality or consent at all. So that puts them in an extremely vulnerable situation. It takes away culpability from men when they commit acts of abuse. And although there's been a lot to try to change the way we think about that, it is still pervasive. As you say, in the language that we use, we talk about teenage pregnancy as something that girls let happen or for some reason they are responsible for it. We don't talk about who's getting them pregnant and things like that. In terms of unconscious bias, then, I've been reading a really fascinating book. It's called Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine. And I liked it because it's a very aggressive title. That's why I picked it up. But she's a neuroscientist, and she talks about how even people who have conscious beliefs in gender equality, who report that they believe in gender equality, that they don't think that sexual difference determines things like behavior, cognition, ability, things like that, they still treat men and women differently in ways that they're not even conscious of. So she talks about loads of different studies, but the ones that stood out to me was that she was talking about two heterosexual couples where they had the same occupations but reversed. So one of them had, the husband was a physician and the wife was an academic professor. And then for this other couple, it was the other way around. The wife was a physician and the husband was an academic professor. And when it came to the point where they were going to have children, for some reason, they decided that the wife's job was more flexible in both cases, and she was expected to sacrifice her career to look after the kids. Even though both couples believed in gender equality, and didn't realize that they were expecting the woman in the couple to sacrifice their career. And these kinds of attitudes are happening. And it just takes time to unlearn. I think that's the tricky thing that people need to understand, is that you grow up with all of these beliefs. You take it, your subconscious takes in so much information, and it doesn't really discriminate in what it takes in. It takes up in images of women in the household because of media, because that's what we're used to. And it keeps it there, and it uses it without you even really knowing about it. And obviously picking up patterns is very useful for survival in different contexts, but it's not useful in consciously establishing gender equality. So I think it's something that we need to recognize in ourselves. It's not enough to say, I believe in gender equality. You have to sort of try and be aware of your own behavior and your own beliefs, and catch yourself thinking different things. And that's really hard, because no one wants to confront that in themselves. I think it's really difficult to look in yourself and think, do I have bigoted beliefs? No one wants to be a bigot, obviously. But if we're going to kind of get deep in there, deep in our brains, and unpick it, that's going to take a long time. The other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of unconscious bias, I definitely felt this growing up. I think in terms of safety, and especially safety in schools, I think we have very sexist attitudes towards school uniform in schools that enforce uniforms. And I think the onus is put on teenage girls to cover up, to not wear things that are too short and too revealing. And I understand that it's going to take effort to desexualize these bodies, because female bodies are presented to us in sexualized ways all the time. And it might be uncomfortable. It might be uncomfortable to see a 13-year-old wearing very short shorts or whatever. It might make you feel a certain way, or it might make you think of something kind of sexual. But bodies are just bodies. It's a teenager's legs walk and do loads of things. They're not for I'm rambling a little bit, but you know, it's I think because we gender bodies in a way and sexualize bodies in that way, we tell girls that their bodies are not their own. They're always subject to the male gaze, and that they need to act accordingly. And I would really love to live in a world where that isn't a problem, because nudity is also a cultural thing. There are some places in the world where nudity is really normalized and it's not particularly sexual. So this kind of constant sexualization of female bodies is a problem. And it's definitely something that I feel as a non-binary person was quite liberating for me, because it meant that I could see my body as degendered, as desexualized. And I've definitely heard that from other non-binary people who were assigned female at birth, that this was kind of liberating for them. So I think certainly an effort to try to understand bodies outside of a binary of sex is going to be very useful as well, in terms of helping people who are assigned female at birth to feel safe in their bodies, definitely.
Oh, perfect. Thanks, Maddie.
Can I come in there? Sorry, Heather, just because I think Maddie's made some really good points, and I think one of the things from Violence Against Women's sector view is that we always said male violence against women, and there's institutional decisions that are made that change that language, that at the time are challenged and at the time are debated, and it's not until later, after the language, after those in power have that opportunity to change that language, that you then discover that there's implications for that. So, for example, it was always male violence against women, then it moved to violence against women, and then it became gender-based violence, and that was a UN decision that was then integrated down into local authorities. And at one meeting at a local authority that I was at, that shall remain nameless, they discovered that the statutory sector didn't centralise the numbers of women who were experiencing violence, because they were marking it as gender-based violence, so they didn't know whether it was male or female. And that language change, and yeah, definitely we've all carried subconscious bias, but we also have to hold our institutions to account for how they change language, and also, as Maddie's talking about that, how they sexualise bodies. So while we've got pornography in the world and we've got external assaults on women's bodies in that sense, it's extremely difficult for individual women then to change that dialect, to change that language, to change that perception, because the pressure's coming in from the institutions and the structures round about. So I just thought it was worth clarifying that it used to be male violence against women, and that wasn't 5 decades ago. That was like in my working life. You know what I mean?
You know, I'm trying to think of the right way to ask this question. The fact that I can't think of the right way to ask it makes the reason I'm asking it more prominent. So we've talked about the subconscious bias and what we all think in our heads that we might not really realise that makes our perceptions of things what they are. But is it due to a lack of knowledge as well? So I'm trying to think the right way to put this, but Maddie, when we first met, I knew very little about non-binary. And actually it's been a great education speaking to you, and you've been open about it and teaching me. But we've come on here and we've talked a lot about male violence, female violence, and we've talked about the wording and what the wording creates in our perceptions and how we think as well. But is there, you know, we've said that there's, Dawn, you said you call it male violence. I've talked about how it says violence against women, and then there's gender violence, but actually that doesn't help to break down. Have we gone a step too far, or a step into, not too far, but the unknown, where people don't know what to do or say, not through a lack of education, I wouldn't say a lack of education, but or a lack of knowledge, that there's the fear of what we do and don't say, or how we say things without, you know, without putting people in boxes or offending people. So we've got another panel coming up, and we had called it the queer panel, but then we had people say that was the wrong word. Whereas for other people, it's a word that's really been brought back. And then we weren't sure what was the right words to use. And there's that clear lack of knowledge. Everyone wants to do the right thing and say the right thing and not be perceived as, you know, bias in any way, but there's that lack of knowledge. So is that, I know we didn't discuss this question in advance, but it keeps popping up, but is that lack of knowledge of what to say, you know, in certain generations even, going to impact how we perceive things or how we treat people? Maddie, do you want to come in on this one? Because we've had this chat in different ways.
Yes, I think language is always going to be a difficult one for me as a non-binary person. Words like male and female don't encompass my experience, but at the same time, there is obviously gendered patterns of violence in which perpetrators are mostly men. So it's a difficult one. I think language can be useful. It can help us describe shared experiences. I think where people trip and maybe misunderstand is that language doesn't always describe reality in its entirety. So we can talk about the fact that most violence is perpetrated by men. I mean, not all, it's not always the case, but most against women. And that's useful to talk about in a political way, because there's mechanisms going on there of masculine power, and power that is given to a certain group, not because of their biology, but because the way that we perceive their biology, the way that we think their biology somehow creates a essential person that is like a certain way and has to be that way. I don't believe that at all. I don't think there's the science to back that up. I think science is increasingly seeing bodies as dynamic things that change. This is a little bit off topic, but I wanted to bring it up at some point, so this might be the time. But I was chatting to someone who was talking about how women are just inherently maternal and more caring, so they're better at things like teaching and caring. But I actually learned through this book that basically if you, sorry, let me start this again. In the cases of rats, which is a very strange thing, but this is, you know, science likes to use rats for demonstrating things. Male rats play absolutely no role in paternity and raising their young. They basically just leave. As soon as the babies arrive, they go away. But if you put a male rat in a space with some babies, it will start to produce the hormone prolactin, which is the same hormone that female bodies produce during lactation. And they'll start to look after the young, because basically biology is not something that happens, that you're born with it and it manifests in a way that's completely deterministic. Your body reacts to external stimuli and your hormones change and your behavior changes in reaction to these kinds of things. So, and it's the same with men as well. If men spend a lot of time bonding with their babies, they produce the same hormone prolactin. So there is no reason to believe that women are inherently more maternal, or this is just part of their biology, because biology is constantly changing, and our biologies are constantly changing. Our bodies are dynamic and fluid. And I think that's also a good way to understand these gender differences. Men aren't inherently violent or aggressive, and we tend to think of that because of popular misunderstandings of testosterone, for example. But they're even like typically female fetuses treated with testosterone in the womb don't become more aggressive or show any more kind of male characteristics once they're born. This is something that Cordelia Fine talks about as well. So I think although language is useful to talk about patterns of behavior and identity in that way, it doesn't describe how people actually are in their entirety. And there is no reason to believe that men are inherently violent, are inherently aggressive. And we need to start talking about that in an honest way, and maybe even offer solutions for redemption and for rehabilitation. I know that's quite controversial, but I do not believe in this pessimistic narrative that men are this way and that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie, for my. Sorry, on you go, Lou.
Yeah, just to tag onto that, like what we were saying earlier about like the feeling that parents have in protecting their kids about that they can't stop abuse, that abuse is kind of inevitable. And I feel like this kind of ties into, yeah, that kind of wider belief that men are just inherently more violent or more aggressive or more likely to inflict abuse. And yeah, that's not biological, but it's learned behavior, and it's culturally learned, and the impetus should be on how do we educate people around abuse, and like how to identify what is an abusive tendency within yourself, regardless of your biology, because these things don't necessarily correlate. You're funneled that way. Yeah, so no, it's just a small tag on point, but
that's perfect. Thank you, Lou, and thank you for understanding my ramblings there as well, and turning that into a good answer to my ramblings. I'm going to switch up the order. I was meant to go to Lee, but I want to carry on this subject and go to you, Lou, again, if that's okay. So obviously you're a musician and you're in the public eye, you're non-binary, and I want to talk about anybody who is, you know, it's not what you would call the norm. You're not male, you're not female, you're not straight. So anybody, you know, through the ages, anybody who stands out as different has been open to abuse, be it physical or verbal. So, and that can be colour, gender, anything. Do you know, as soon as you show something that's not, you know, the straight and narrow, you open yourself up to, or not open yourself up to, others use that as a potential, they see it potentially as a weakness. And that comes back to obviously women being seen as a weakness in the past as well. So I want to talk to you, Lou, about how you find that, you know, your experiences. Have you found you know, that you have been subject to more abuse than normal? Or I want to go on to as well, I know that's important to you to talk about the legal protections around that too, because again, in the past, and as Dawn said, there's been things that have changed to the ages that have allowed females to be more accepted, have more rights, go out to work and move on. But are we there yet with the likes of yourself as non-binary? Have we got those same protections?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll start with like kind of chatting about.
Sorry, that was a lot to throw at you there.
No, it's all right. I'm trying to think where to
Pick
start.
away at that as much as you like.
Yeah, so it's interesting for me because I came out as non-binary 2 years ago, and up until that point, I'd lived my life as a cis man, and I'd been socialized as such. And the kind of revelation of transness kind of came when I was doing a lot of gender reading and realizing what it means for gender to be a social construction as opposed to the kind of gender essentialism that we've been talking about as a kind of widespread belief, and realizing that, and then I don't know, realizing that something isn't inherent to you, and I felt like I had to give it up, and I feel much healthier and happier for doing so. But that has all been in the context of the pandemic. So although I have been in a kind of virtual public eye since then, I haven't been out of the town that much in the last 2 years since coming out as trans, and that's definitely something that I am anxious about as things begin to open up, and I'll be, well, hopefully out and about a bit more. Yeah, especially with the rise of hate crime against trans people in Scotland at the moment. Yeah.
So obviously we talked about that rise in hate crime at the moment, and you know, I can imagine it is worrying for you, and I hope that you don't receive any of that. But do you think there's stuff that needs to be done in regards legally to making it more secure? I don't know if it was Dawn or Maddie said before that if there was precautions for people who committed violence, then maybe they wouldn't do it. If they knew there was something else on the other side, they wouldn't do it. Do you feel that you have those same protections?
Yeah. I guess my answer to, yeah, I don't want, I guess my kind of long-term answer to gender safety isn't like trying to deter people from inflicting abuse with the possibility of repercussions. Mm-hmm. It's rather just like getting people to understand that like there is no valid reason to inflict abuse on someone else. Like it's not about, I don't know, a situation where you could act abusively and then be like, oh, but I won't do that because I'll be in prison for it. I don't want to inflict abuse on you because there is a better way to act. And I think it should be around like, how do we get there? Yeah, I guess so. This can kind of tie into the legal side of things, and how, so currently non-binary people aren't legally recognized in the UK. However, there's a few countries in the world that do what are called third gender passports. And so that the US is one, they've recently started putting these out. And I'm not actually sure what the state of culpability is for Madge. You might be able to help me out on like what kind of legal.
So
I don't.
I'm not sure what legal protections we have, because I'm almost certain from what I've read in the legislation that if we experienced harassment, then we could describe it as gender discrimination. But a lot of the legislation I've read that talks about non-binary people and as a protected characteristic doesn't really understand non-binariness very well. So they talk about it as a third gender or a third sex, or as a transitioning gender, or a kind of in-between sex. But it's not really what non-binariness is.
Yeah,
Like my body is outwardly, at least, quite typically female. I wouldn't describe my sex as in between. I mean, I don't know what my chromosomes are. I don't know what my hormones are. That's another story. And to be honest, it's not really any governing body's business anyhow. But non-binary gender is a social and political statement about how biological sex is constructed in a gendered way, and often a needlessly gendered way. So in terms of having like a third sex passport or third gender passport, I would like to know why it's pertinent to why I need to travel, and why we need to give this information in the first place. Why, I mean, really, they're just asking you about your genitals, I suppose.
That's
but
my
why?
that's my qualm with it, is that ultimately, if me and you are to be recognized as citizens of wherever in a way that suits my how I feel about my body, it would be an identity where I'm not asked about my genitals, because I don't feel that dictates any part of myself other than my genitals, which is irrelevant for them to know. So like the whole idea of them incorporating a kind of non-binary system would necessitate that for everyone, because it kind of calls it into question for everyone to kind of be like, oh, why do they need to know that? If we're going to talk about undoing underlying sexism and ideas that sex maps onto gender, I don't know. I feel like the whole thing needs to be thrown out in order for a system to accept non-binariness in its fullness. If that makes sense.
Can I just clarify? If you identify under transgender, you should be able to access hate crime legislation. Now that's still in the process of going through, but there is already stuff in place. So I'm just conscious if people are watching this, you can report any assault on you based on your transgender, or any verbal attack, or any threat, or through the hate crime legislation. At this point, we're still waiting on that legislation for women. What I would also say as well is that it's just a great conversation, because this is big. I'm sitting here and I'm going, 100 years we've been trying to get Mr. and Mrs. and male and female off applications for jobs. Do you know what I mean? It's like this is the same argument that women and feminists have been having for years, which is good, because we're getting into this new place, and how we work together with that and think about that, I think, is really important. But it's back to what you were saying, Maddie. The individual experience, the individual reality, and the patterns of behaviour that we see in society, I think we have to find ways to balance that, so that as an individual we can be who we want to be and we can be protected, but also that as a society we can recognise where there is oppression. And this is about all groups, and I'm dead consciously sitting there because I'm dying to hear, because I think that you know, because I think that the oppression that men in working class positions and professions experience is often lost, because we don't. I mean, Maddie, you were talking about gender as a protected characteristic. It doesn't even have that status. Do you know what I mean? But we don't have working class. We don't have class. We don't have poverty. We don't have any of that in there either. So it's like there's multiple things that has to be done, and that intersectional experience of oppression is so important to us as individuals. So yes, we need to change culture. Yes, we need to have conversations. But until such times as it's safe to do so, we need to also make sure. I personally don't think we need it in a passport. I don't. But you know what I mean? It's like there has to be other areas where that is protected, so that individually, we can see the individual experience as a societal issues. I'll be quiet now, so I'm down to hear Lee.
No, that's good. You know what? It's quite good. Bring it back to the safety point of things. So yeah, so there is legal protection there.
Yeah.
People can, whatever crime there is, it can be reported.
Unless you're a woman.
We won't go on to conviction rates today. That's a whole other panel.
Also, we're not included in hate crime.
Lee, last
Yes.
but not least. So, Lee, we're so grateful for you coming on, because as we discussed before, it has been so difficult to get males from male-orientated or, in the past, and, it takes time, like Maddie said, male-orientated industries is still there just now. So building, construction, we've had it really hard to get guys to come on. And I was trying to work out, what do we ask you and why are guys not coming on? And a lot of it is because I think, and you're going to answer this for us, but we put you all in a box historically. So the industries that you work in has been seen as, a bunch of laddish guys, they wolf whistle at women, etc. And I wanted to discuss, is that still the way it is? If it is, how do you feel within that? When you were young going into the industry, how did you feel about it? Did you feel that you were pulled into that behaviour? But also I want to flip it around as well. I'm doing what I did with everyone else, just fling it all on you at once. But I want to flip it around as well, isn't that, how do you feel about being put in that box of being a laddish guy who wolf whistles? And I know obviously it's important to you, this subject, because of the wee Bella Rose as well. So, if that is the way it is, then how is that going to affect the way things change for the younger generations, which is the main thing around this whole campaign?
Yeah, do you know, Heather, this is quite a tough question for me to answer, because I think the reason why you find it tough to have guys come on panels like this is because they're probably terrified of too much criticism, or they're terrified of taking things the wrong way, as opposed to looking at things with an open mind and not be defensive as soon as they hear male cultures being criticised. So I think if more people looked at things with an open mind, then less people would be scared to contribute and join in and put their opinions across, regardless of what their opinions are. But the reason why the question on my industry is tough is because I know what the general perception is of my industry, with it being predominantly male populated. But for me personally, I work in a family-run business, and I work in a section of the industry that I virtually never saw the behaviour that you speak about going on around me. And that's only because I work in a certain part of that industry, but it is a huge part of the industry. I work in domestic home improvements, where it's small, compact teams, whether it's friends, whether it's family-run businesses. You're working in close contact with your clients, with your customers, and it's such a welcoming environment for anybody who wanted to join that industry. And that's why I would ask the question of, why is it predominantly a male-populated industry? Perceptions of the industry in general would probably answer that question. But when you start to pick away at it and isolate different segments of the industry, then it should be more open, and it should be more populated by everyone and not just males. So it is quite tough for me to talk about the industry in general, but in terms of the part of the industry that I work in, I've never seen that behaviour, but yet I still don't have females, for talking sake, emailing me looking for job opportunities. I don't walk into the builders merchants and very rarely ever see a female working in a certain trade. When I served my apprenticeship, there wasn't any, it was all guys that was in my class. The 2 apprentices that I've got on my books at the moment, it's all guys that's in their classes as well. So I just want to know personally myself why there's the industry isn't more inclusive for everyone and not just males.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think maybe it comes back to that historical, you know, it's been seen in the past as a male industry, and it takes time to change things. I used to know a female who was a plumber, and she was so busy. She was so busy, and I was like, I wished I'd gone and done that because she was so busy. Yeah, it was a complete eye opener, and she was really trying to get more females into the industry. Do you think, Lee, I think it's really interesting what you said at the start about the reason that men don't want to talk is they are potentially scared of what they, you know, what the reaction of others is going to be. Have you found that, I suppose there's talking about men policing other men, you know, it's in the industry, I know you're very lucky that you've not seen that, but guys in general, maybe in certain subjects, do you find that if you want to have, you know, an opinion, like I want females in this industry, I'm going to go and promote and get females into my industry, whereas the more laddish guys that people have that perception of, would you worry that you wouldn't be able to speak up because, I think there's a lot of males don't want to speak up because of what other males would say?
Yeah, I think that's probably the main reason, Heather.
Yeah.
And I'm not outspoken in a kind of abrupt way. I like to be outspoken. If I do feel strongly about something, then I'll speak about it. And around this subject that we're talking about, what makes me feel even stronger about that is because I now have a daughter. So I look at how things happen round about me in my industry. I listen to a lot of radio, and I listen to campaigns like Strut Safe and Sabina Project, which gets quite a lot of recognition and pedestals on radio. And yeah, I think that a lot of males are terrified to give their honest opinion and speak up about certain things in case other people then have an opinion of them.
Yeah.
And like I said, the more people that feel kind of liberated to give an honest opinion about something, then I think the more things can change. But I do think that companies are trying to change in the construction industry. A lot of companies out there, since I started working in the industry, I do see them taking on a lot of females on their books. And that's just through reading different things, watching different things. But I still don't think it's enough because I don't see enough within my industry myself. So where is the hurdle to make that transition? That's I want to know. Where is the hurdle to try and make it a more inclusive industry, to try and encourage more people out with males to join the industry, for people within the industry to feel free to speak about things, to offer their opinions, to put a stop to something or put a halt to something if they feel as if there's somebody saying something that's not correct or somebody doing something that's not correct. So I think, yeah, within my industry, I think it is going to take a lot more people to stand strong, speak up, and maybe make it more inclusive to other people out with just males who predominantly do populate it at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually how we were talking about, you know, you coming on, Lee, and you being that male industry, and everyone's first thought was actually talking about that old perception of wolf whistling stuff, whereas you know, the main point that I've taken from this, from speaking to you, is that actually let's get by that. Do you know, let's get by that. We always talk about females being discriminated against, but let's get by that and actually look at, you know, how do we get females into the industry? You know, I think it's a nice way to turn it around rather than just look at the wolf whistle. Well, actually, here's an industry that females aren't in. How are we going to get females into it?
Yeah. Can I come in there?
Yeah,
institutional Annie here. Sorry, Lee, I've got a 17-year-old daughter who's trying to get into STEM, and we are never, ever, ever going to get women into industries like Lee's talking about without the education system, because the way my daughter's been treated has been appalling. And for a young woman who's focused on design and manufacturing, who's focused on all the things and has secured a place in a college by herself with no help, despite the fact she's had to see 2 guidance teachers for product design, when they've done that tick box thing that they do with you for what you should be, and it's they came out with her and they said she should go into a social worker. Now I said to her, if you had been a wee pal Ross who's doing the same subjects as her, I doubt very much he'd have been told to be a social worker. And I think that's where the block is. But I think the challenge that we've got is, I had an ex-partner who worked in shipyards. He had a horrendous time because he was very much like you, very open, very, do you know what I mean, equality based. But he went down to Barrow-in-Furness at one point. And years ago in Barrow-in-Furness, they brought people down from Scotland because they didn't have enough people to do the trades. So there was a lot of women down there. And he says the difference in the shipyard was unbelievable. There was no swearing. There was no bringing in strippers for people's birthdays. There was no, do you know what I mean? That really horrible stuff with large groups of men where dominant men dominate and the other men just got on with their job. None of that was there. And I think that it's so vital that this institutions again support the community to be able to provide what allows that change, that cultural change to happen, and that then will reinforce the change that we're wanting. So I just thought it was really interesting. Sorry.
Guys, I'm very conscious of time. I did say that we'd keep it till 12 o'clock and I've got 1 minute to get on to all with your what ifs. It's been an absolutely amazing subject. I think actually we could, as always with all these panels, just sit here and talk for another hour.
Yeah, sorry Heather, I would like to just comment on that as well, that I do think there could be a lot more talking to be done about this, because I think there's a lot more to be said, and a lot more that could be said that could probably be very constructive going forward. So we can maybe see if we can make that happen at a later date.
Definitely. I think we, like all these panels, we start conversations, and unless we can all sit on the table for the rest of the day, we never quite finish. I mean, that was the purpose in this campaign. When we did that one panel in November, there wasn't enough time to discuss it, and it has become quite apparent even a year is not enough time to discuss it. So yeah, we'll definitely pick up on a lot of points. So I want to go around the table and going back to this so what but what if. We've talked about a lot of the so what's today, and I want to ask you all individually, what would be your what if you could change something around perceptions or safety in general? What would it be? So, Maddie.
So, yeah, I just wanted to say very quickly, I don't have an answer as to why male socialization so often involves degrading women, but what I do know is that masculinity can be whatever we want it to be. It is not determined by biology at all. So my what if is, what if we let go of biological determinism regarding sex and gender?
Thank you, Maddie. Dawn?
I've got 1,000,001 running through my head, but because I'm here from Wise Women, I'm going to say we're going through massive change just now. What if we put women's safety at the centre of that? And that would mean safer communities for all.
Perfect. Lou?
Yeah, I guess just kind of to reiterate some stuff that came up earlier, but what if we stop making it mandatory asking for people's sex and for titles as well, like we said, Mr. and Mrs., because that is effectively the same thing. What people are really asking is, what are your genitals? And I don't think that's an appropriate question. So that's my what if.
Lee, last but not least.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So my what if is based around my own thoughts on this, and also to hopefully fiercely protect my daughter going forward in her career, whatever she decides to do. So what if there were no gender-dominated industries?
I really like that one. Okay, thank you so much to all the panelists. Do you know, every time we come on these, I get really annoyed when it gets to the finishing time because I've got more questions, and I always make about 2 or 3 pages of notes to prep for it, and then have 2 or 3 pages of questions after. So I'm probably going to contact you all again afterwards. Just for everyone that's watching, thank you so much. I think what has become quite apparent from this conversation is that the conversation needs to happen, and the more the conversation happens, the more people that have the conversation, the quicker things will change. There's a lot of historical stuff there. It will take time, and that's come out in everything everyone's said. We appreciate it takes time, but we all have to actually make that effort to talk in order for that time to speed up slightly. There's definitely a part of the legal system and the powers that be that can make this happen quicker as well. So we will carry on this discussion further. I feel like it's not finished at all. But coming up next, on May the 20th, we have our next panel, which is on consent, which is going to be quite an interesting one, because to me, consent is black and white, no is no. So where are we going wrong? And what can we do to change that? So that's an interesting coming one up, and in the next couple of weeks we will be releasing the panelists for that. On the 17th of June, we've got online dangers and grooming, and then into July, sex workers and pornography. So some really meaty subjects coming up, some more great panels. And our one ask from all of you is to share your what ifs with us on social. It can be in One for Growth, it can be in Glasgow Girls Club, So What, or Thriving Survivors. If you've got anything you want to share with us, any stories, or you want to be a panel that we mentioned, please do get in touch. But most of all, have the discussions and share this discussion, and let's see if we can speed up the time part of this conversation. Thank you so much, everybody.